now we've kind of looked at how, we've got this grandiosity, which is very much an internal pride, looking at our limitations and our capabilities and causing us to overestimate ourselves in all kinds of different ways. And then we have vanity, which is going to be tempting us into trying to manifest our inflated self-image into the perceptions of others. So the final aspect of pride, or the final strategy that pride is going to use to destroy your life, is vulnerability. And essentially what that is it's the effects of pride that come as a result of other people's perceptions of you being inflated, which is quite the mouthful. But essentially, and we talked about this in vanity, which is when you attempt to manifest your inflated self-image in reality, you run the risk of stirring envy in especially those who are susceptible to envy. But if you're really effective at it, even people who may not necessarily have such a deflated ego or self-image that they're going to be that susceptible to envy. This doesn't only come as a result of pride. So if you look at Julius Caesar, for example, he wasn't necessarily a notoriously prideful individual. In fact, he was a great leader of Rome, and because of that, a lot of the citizens decided to, I don't remember what the Roman word for it was, or the Latin word for it was, but they essentially named him dictator for life, right? And that came from this great admiration that a lot of the citizens had for him, because he was, he was passing out a lot of land to a lot of the poorer class, and he was creating really good social systems, and he was, his foreign policies were, I wouldn't say they were necessarily peaceful, but they were aggressive as they needed to be, and as peaceful as they could be. And so because of this, the people loved him. They started to build statues of him, and they named him emperor for life, essentially, or dictator for life. He wasn't necessarily a prideful individual, but the other senators and politicians of the time grew envious of the amount of power that he had, and they grew envious of the prestige that he had, and the admiration that the people had for him, and some of them grew fearful of his status, right? And they're like, well, dictator for life, that could be abused really damn easily. But at the time that the conspirators actually assassinated him, there was no real evidence that he had any plans to do anything that was against the interest of the vast majority of Roman citizens. And so their assassination of him was ultimately a result of envy, and there's certainly fear that was a factor of it. And that came not necessarily as a result of pride. So it's important to remember that you can stir envy and bring about these consequences of vulnerability without pride alone. However, pride is going to definitely tempt you into doing the things that will plant the seeds of self-destruction, right, through the stirring of envy. I think a great example of this is Alcibiades of ancient Greece. Alcibiades of ancient Athens is a great example of vanity and how inflating your public image can evoke envy or stir envy and evoke some fear and cause you to suffer consequences that you otherwise wouldn't have as a result of others seeking to destroy you because of the fear and the envy that you've stirred. So a couple of the ways that he manifested his vanity was, first, he was often found surrounded by what we can call sycophants, or just people who admired him. And he would always kind of seek out these people who admired him and surround himself with them and talk with them, and they would all be kind of googly-eyed at him, and you could often find him in the streets of Athens surrounded by that kind of a crowd. In his younger age, when he was in school, he couldn't bear to be seen as inferior to anyone for any reason. And one really kind of crazy example of this was in the school system. They had everyone learn how to play the flute, and he was pretty terrible at it. And so instead of trying to get good at it or just being bad at it or whatever, instead he basically fought against the idea of having the flute in the school system, and rallied so many of the other students against trying to learn the flute that they actually got rid of the flute as a whole from the school system, which was pretty interesting, kind of crazy. And that's one interesting thing about having an inflated public image, is you do gain a lot of influence. And we'll talk about that in a second, but I'll talk about it right now. Alcibiades and Napoleon and many other prideful individuals do gain a lot of influence by being able to inflate this public image and evoke a lot of admiration in others. But what often happens is they screw up and they evoke envy and fear. Maybe they go a few steps too far, or they create that enemy and all that well, what I'm about to describe happens. But there are a couple of examples of people who are able to have a great amount of power, create this great public image, and not have that lead to their downfall. And two examples of this would be Augustus and Pericles. Augustus of Rome, and Pericles from ancient Athens, who Alcibiades actually grew up with. So looking into them could be interesting if you're curious about that idea. But for now, we'll focus on how vanity can ruin your life. So he was also known for extravagant material investments. For example, his shield when he joined the cavalry was incredibly, you could say, narcissistic or inflated in a sense. It was made shining with gold and inlaid with ivory, and on it had Eros, one of the oldest and most respected gods, wielding the thunderbolt of Zeus. So very, very, very dramatic. and very arrogant almost symbolism on his shield. He also spent a huge amount of money on housing, more so than anyone would have been known to back then. Generally, people wouldn't go out and just have extra houses here or there. That's not too uncommon now among wealthy people. But he had at least 2 countryside estates. He had a huge townhouse where he would host parties and have all kinds of people coming in, and he had multiple ancestral estates. And it was almost unheard of to have that much housing. He also had very extravagant clothing. There'd be a talk in the town about his clothing. He wore exquisite perfume. He wore very distinctive shoes that would catch the eye of everyone. He walked by and he wore expensive purple robes. And what this was really interesting is he cared not for ruining his clothes or his purple robes. And back then, the color purple was very hard to get. There was some like shellfish or something underneath the sea that you had to go and kill and take something out of it in order to get purple dye. Was what they made out of. The first Stoic, Zeno, was a purple dye merchant, and he was super rich off it until he like screwed up and lost all of his dye. But yeah, so his clothing was very expensive, and he kind of flaunted it by showing that he didn't care if he ruined it. He also had a very inflated public image since he was young. Pericles' wife, I can't remember her name right now, but she was very well known in Athens. And at the age of like 12 or so, she was arguably the most prominent Athenian woman in all of Athens history. Not that women had many opportunities to be prominent, but she was. Well, that actually says more about how impressive it was for how prominent she was. But Alcibiades, at just the age of 12, was as influential and as known as she was. So that was really interesting. And so he had this public image at such a young age, and there were rumors that would be spread about him even by the time he was 12. And when he was 20 years old, during his the Battle of Potidæa, he received the award for bravery in battle, and that's a very highly respected award to get back in the days of Athens, and so that brought a lot of attention to him. He became a prominent statesman. He had very strong foreign relations. He had friends in almost every city all around Athens, or not around Athens, around all of Greece, even in Athens' enemy states. And he was often the one to go to these enemy states and talk with their statesmen and talk with his friends there and actually create alliances for Athens. So that's really impressive. He was known at a young age as well to be the candidate to follow in the shoes of Pericles. Pericles was huge. He was also well networked with various philosophers like Socrates, Plato. He was of course involved with a lot of politicians and the overall high class, Athenian high class at a young age. Alcibiades later attends the Olympic Games after the Periclean age ends. In other words, Pericles dies, and Alcibiades enters the Olympic Games. At this point, he's very well respected. He's well loved. He's incredibly charismatic, and people are kind of seeing him as possibly the up and coming Pericles. And he pulls up to the Olympic Games, and he only entered. He didn't enter one, but he entered 7 chariots for the 4-horse chariot race, which is the equivalent of 28 horses, which is a ridiculous amount of horses and an extravagant show of wealth and power. You think about back then, the more horses, they were kind of like cars back then. So if you had a lot of horses, it's like you got a lot of wealth, and getting such high quality horses is a representation of one's power, because it shows that you're networked and it shows that you are able to have access to the best of the best. And at the time, the Athenians were pretty down with it, because he made it seem as though it was a show of their power, as a collective representation of Athens as a whole. And when he gets to the Olympic Games, one of his friends, from Ephesus, gave him a very extravagant Eastern tent, which was twice the size of the one that was for the official Athens delegation. And so he hung out in that, and he threw all kinds of parties during the Olympic Games, and everybody was very dumbfounded by the grandeur of this tent. And he ended up winning all first, second, and third place in the Olympic Games, which was huge, and the Athenians were loving that. But afterwards, he goes on to start flaunting his victories. So first he singularly hosts the after party as an opportunity for self-aggrandizement, and everybody goes, oh, well, it's kind of, a very showy move. He gets gold, silverware, and tableware that he borrowed from the Athenian treasury, and he doesn't say that he borrowed it from the Athenian treasury. He just kind of appears with it. And then he continues, even after the Olympic Games, after they go back to Athens and after this grand celebration, he continues to celebrate in Athens. First off, he commissioned 2 paintings from the prominent artist Aglaophon. And the first had 2 goddesses crowning Alcibiades with victory clothing and with victory clothing. And the other one had a very attractive goddess sitting enthroned with Alcibiades on her knee and her arms around his neck, which is very, again, very, literally inflating his public image with this kind of imagery. And he kept himself at the focus of the public eye for quite some time. And so, like his grandfather, Magicles IV, who won at Delphi, he commissioned the poet Pindar to give his commencement speech. Alcibiades recruited Euripides, another very prominent poet at this time, to give his what they might call the victory ode. Now, here's something that's really interesting. Magicles IV, Alcibiades' grandfather, when he won the Olympic Games in Delphi, or it was some kind of race in Delphi. I don't know if it was actually the Olympic Games. He hired Pindar to give his victory ode, and one of the lines in Pindar's victory ode says, "My heart leaps at this new success, but even so I sorrow. Great exploits spark great envy, and the saying is true. Good fortune, flowering for all time, brings with it not just happiness, but tragedy." Now, this quote is representative of basically Athens as a whole, which is very fascinating. But it also became true of Alcibiades, not only a few generations later. It's important to understand an aspect of Athenian democracy, which was the practice of ostracism. So after the tyrannical rulers Persistratus and Hippias, the Athenians start to practice ostracism, so that if any one individual was amassing too much power, they would kick him out of Athens for 10 years, and then at the end of the 10 years, they would be allowed to come back and continue their life in Athens like nothing had ever changed. All their belongings would be left to them. They would be able to resume their engagement with politics, but they'd be sent away. And this was to curb the power of rising tyrants. And not long after narrowly evading ostracism after the Olympic Games, Alcibiades ended up getting accused of two crimes. He allegedly got drunk one night and vandalized a bunch of statues around Athens, allegedly. And he was also accused of talking shit on the mysteries of Eleusis, which is one of the most sacred Athenian religious institutions. And that's an interesting institution to do some research on, because it has a lot of very fascinating symbolic representations within it, but that's not the point here. And essentially what was happening was, during this time when he was accused of these things, Alcibiades was amassing a huge amount of power, especially after his victory in the Olympics. His foreign relations were at an all-time high. He was becoming very prominent on the Athenian stage, and he was stealing a lot of the power from his competitors. And ultimately what happens is his political competitors grew envious of him, and they were like, we got to get this guy out of here, otherwise we're screwed. And in order to do that, they were able to twist all of these things from the past which people had admired in him, and they were able to use that in order to evoke fear in everyone else. And so it took, he eventually passed a threshold where his rivals were motivated enough to seize any opportunity they could to take him down, and allegedly getting drunk and vandalizing some sacred statues or whatever was enough. And since he had spent so much time flaunting his wealth and power, it was easy to make a public case against him to fear him instead of respecting him. And as soon as you make that twist and you take that to paint it as a picture of a tyrant, it's a very fast fall. And so while Alcibiades is off fighting a war in Sicily, or fighting the campaign, the Sicilian campaign, emotions are running high in Athens, and he ends up getting accused of treason, and so they're going to put him to death. And they go and they ask him, like, "Hey man, you've got to come back because we're going to put you to death." And instead of going back, he ran away, which is a very sensible thing to do. But he narrowly escaped death as a result of all his flaunting all of his victories and his successes, and seeming so great and grandiose. It wasn't long before that really took a turn for him. If he had instead remained humble about it, even if he had, if he had been able to remain humble with all that power and with all that wealth, he could have, at the very least, created the appearance that he had much less power and wealth. And he couldn't do that because he gave into that temptation of vanity. He gave into that temptation of making himself be perceived as all that he wanted people to perceive him as, and all that his inflated self-image told him he was. And even as a younger kid, he often, there are a lot of quotes out there, I didn't write any of them down, but he would often say things that were very very prideful, that really created a distinction between him and his noble political greatness and the family that he was born into, and a distinguishment that made between him and the commoners. And so he really had this perspective from a very young age of wanting to be admired by the masses, and that led to him having to leave his homeland. Although after he leaves his homeland, he does pull off some very fascinating maneuvers in and these other, well, he runs away to Sparta, Athens' greatest enemy at the time, and kind of gets all buddied up with them, and then does the same with Persia, and then gets back with Athens. So that's a very fascinating story. That's for another day. So looking at that story, we kind of see that he obviously had a real heightened sense of self, which arguably was useful in many cases, and may have been a part of why he reached such heights of power and influence in Greece, and went on to help him in other situations. But he had to abandon Athens because of his past of manifesting his self-image into his public image, his inflated self-image, and because of all this kind of glamorous, these glamorous perceptions that people had of him, it was easy to use that to stir envy and fear. And that's the risk you run when you give into vanity and when you manifest your self-image. Now, again, as in the situation with Caesar, there is the element that it does not require pride to tempt you into vanity, to suffer those consequences. And in that case, there are defenses that you can build, and doing what we're about to discuss will help build those defenses. But learning how to perceive the perceptions of others effectively is a massive skill in and of itself that we can put off for another time. That could be a whole course of its own. Here's what you're going to want to do to protect yourself from envy attacks, from envy attacks and from fear-driven attacks. Right? You're going to want to balance the perception that people have of you, your public image, the perceived reality of you in other people's minds. You're going to want to actively balance that, especially after gaining any kind of success or victory. So one incredibly good example of this is in business. Let's say you accomplish something great in the company, you get a promotion, or you land a big sale for the company. I don't know. So you accomplish something great, right, in your field of business. And as a result, there are accolades that go towards you. And during this time, it's going to cause your coworkers to it's going to stir envy within your coworkers, because they're kind of like, oh man, like he's doing better than me, like fuck. Especially in a competitive environment like that. And oftentimes what we'll do, ourselves thinking, we'll say something like, oh, it was all hard work. If you just do the right things and you play the game properly, then you can get the same heights of accomplishment that I have. And internally we're thinking that might be reassuring to those who are still climbing the ranks, and reassuring to your coworkers, where in saying that, oh, you don't have to rely on luck to get here. You can do it as a result of your own ambitions. But what that translates to in the perception of others is essentially, I didn't have any luck. You guys are just lazy pieces of shit that aren't working as hard as I am, and you don't deserve what I just accomplished or what I got. It's not a result of, there are no external factors that cause this. It's my own skill and talent that cause that. And then when they see that, they're thinking, okay, well, if it's his skill and talent, or at least he's claiming it is, then that means that my skill and talent is less than his, and that means, because as humans we tend to generalize these kinds of ideas, and then they'll go like, okay, well, that just means I'm inferior to him, and then they'll be envious, right? And then if they're already insecure, then they'll be envious and revengeful. If they're prideful, then maybe they'll be envious and repress that envy, but then that envy will come out in other ways and do what an envier attack. One example of a way that envious individuals will attack you, one type of envy attack, is that they'll do what's called the leveling strategy. And so they see themselves as operating down here, and they see you operating up here, and instead of trying to bring themselves up to that level, they'll try to bring you down to this level. And so they'll pick apart all of your weaknesses and exacerbate them and bring attention to them. And then when that enters the perceptions of others, it can be very problematic. And we kind of saw that happen with Alcibiades. On the other hand, with let's say your boss, or somebody who's above you in some form, which is not a sexual one, is going to see your, well, maybe, anyway, is going to see your growth not as, oh, impressive, and oh, this, I want to bring them up to my level because I have the opportunity to do this, generally. So there are counterexamples to this, and we're going to look at that later. But a lot of bosses and a lot of your superiors are going to see this, and they're going to feel a sense of fear for the position that they are in, and they're going to want to sit comfortably superior to you. And when that comes in question, they're going to become afraid. They're going to try to widen that gap, and in order to do that, most of the time, because it takes a lot of work to elevate themselves, they're going to try and push you down. And if they have any sort of power over you, that's going to become extremely dangerous. So in both of these cases, you want to bring attention to your weaknesses, especially when your strengths are on display through the evidence of your actions. You want to allow people to see your weaknesses. You want to bring attention to the luck that inevitably got you to where you are. And there is that luck, you just have to find it. And doing that alone is going to help bring down the internal ideas of pride, or the internal drives of pride, right? Because when we accomplish something, we might think it's all because of us, and we're so great, we did this and that, and we have to be willing to admit that there's some degree of luck involved in accomplishing anything. And if we can do that, it'll help kind of simmer those feelings of grandiosity. Ultimately, your goal is to have people respect you, to see that you do have your strengths, you do have these things that you're able to do, but you want them to always sit comfortably perceive themselves as sitting comfortably superior to you. So, you don't want them to perceive you as a worthless piece of shit, because that's not really going to help you in any way either. Nobody wants to help or involve themselves with somebody who's going to drag them down. Especially in business. They want people who are going to have something to contribute. But if they're afraid that what you have to contribute is greater than what they have to contribute, they're going to be fearful or envious and seek to destroy you. And so you want people to always feel like you have some worth to offer, but for themselves to feel safely superior. The second way that pride is going to make you vulnerable is in other people's ability to take advantage of that which you are prideful about. And so a great story that I think illustrates the ability for, and this is less so, in that first case we're looking at more insecure types. In some regards, prideful types can fall into the category of having envy or fear stirred. And then directing that fear and envy towards you, and then that leads to your downfall. The second is from another type of person, which is a degree or two more, I want to say more intelligent, because intelligence is complicated, but they'll be less emotionally driven, right? They're going to be a little bit more on the psychopathic side, if you will. But these people exist, and essentially what they do, or Machiavellian. And these are essentially the manipulators. And these are the ones who observe their surroundings. They observe people to great depth, which is something you should do as well. And by observing people, they are able to see a clear image, that whole extra course that we could do, that I talked about. They're able to contemplate the perceived reality of other people, and they're able to recognize the self-image that other people have, and they're able to utilize this understanding of how you perceive reality to direct your actions in a way that benefits them. And that's ultimately at the root of manipulation. And then they've got their own ends that they want to reach, and then in order to do that, they might use you. And being prideful is going to make you extremely susceptible to those manipulations. It's also going to, as in vanity, cause you to reveal that information very clearly to those who are observant. Third, pride is just going to blind you to the reality of people who are manipulating you, because generally, if you have an inflated self-image, or if pride being a part of all of us, we generally tend to want to think to ourselves that we are good judges of other people's character. And the reality is, generally, unless we put exorbitant amounts of time and effort, and I mean, maybe taking a good course, maybe I'll do a course about this, but put a good amount of studying and research into being able to genuinely recognize and contemplate the quality of people's characters, odds are that's not a skill that we actually have. And pride will convince us, and it convinces most people, that's a skill that we have without having actually put the work into developing it. And so because of this, we might think, we'll befriend people and we'll think, oh, this person is like a good person to be around, and we project this belief that we have about ourselves onto them, thinking that we judge them to be a good person, when in fact they aren't. They're just taking advantage of us and manipulating us. And then when we start to see the signs of that we should question them, we'll kind of ignore those signs, and we'll kind of like, no, they're I've deemed them worthy or whatever, and then that just gives them more control and more ability to maneuver you and to play the puppet master. And then the more we justify this to ourselves, the more pride makes us believe that the more pride blinds us to those signs, that we are susceptible to being controlled by others, which is not a happy admission to make. And so, generally what we have to do is swallow our pride, really look at the facts and think, maybe they are like just smart. It makes us feel like they're smarter than us, but ultimately they're just, it's a skill set that they've developed and they've practiced and that they are utilizing. And to counteract, there's a skill set that we have to develop. Pride is simply going to blind us to the need to develop that skill set. It's going to blind us to the reality of it happening when it's happening. So first, it's going to reveal key information that our enemies can use. Second, it's going to allow manipulators essentially to hide in plain sight. And then finally, it's going to allow these manipulative, or these cunning individuals or manipulators to lower and heighten our defenses as they need. Once they have a good, clear image of what it is that you're prideful about, they'll go on to lower your defenses, and by lowering your defenses, I mean make you more susceptible to influence, more susceptible to their influence specifically, more willing to compromise for whatever it is that they want, and just more easily directable, more emotionally susceptible to their wishes and demands, and they're able to kind of maneuver their way into our thought processes and our emotions, and kind of get a hold on what we're actually going to talk about next in the awareness chapter, which is the emotional, the cognitive triangle. It also adds an air of predictability to your actions. And I could talk about this, ramble about this as well, but I think a story about Napoleon Bonaparte and Mr. Talleyrand, it will serve its purpose. Will serve our purpose very well. So Talleyrand was a very interesting individual during the Napoleonic era of France, and he was able to use Napoleon's pride in order to essentially bait him into an ultimate defeat, worse than what happened with being sent away to Elba. So we've been talking so far about how manipulators can use people's pride against them. Um, but it's also the case that if you want to be able to defend against prideful people like perhaps Napoleon, who are almost tyrannical, you might want to be able to use strategies that are going to cause them to make mistakes, that are going to cause you to be able to defeat them, because there are going to be destructive people in the world that if you want to do some good, you're going to have to be able to stop them. And this is essentially what Talleyrand did. So he had a after Napoleon's fall, he's exiled to Elba, and this is an island which is surrounded by a bunch of British ships armed with cannons. And Talleyrand, who used to be Napoleon's foreign minister, who actually betrayed Napoleon because he was like, holy shit, Napoleon's freaking crazy. Talleyrand told the Congress of Vienna that Napoleon was far too dangerous to be on Elba, that Elba was too close to civilization and to France, and that they needed to exile him somewhere further away. But the Congress of Vienna wouldn't have it, and so instead of trying to coerce everyone into listening to him, Talleyrand allied with the foreign ministers of England and Austria, and in order to create a plan to defeat Napoleon once and for all, a plan to defeat him to the point that he could never return, because on Elba there was a shimmer of hope. And so Talleyrand sends a bunch of advisors to Elba in order to talk to Napoleon and make him believe that if he were able to escape, that all the European powers would welcome him back, and that his people in France would love to have him back in power. And so after being told that, he was also told that the English would let him leave, and because Talleyrand allied with a foreign minister from England, he was actually able to arrange that the ships would allow him to escape. And so after being humiliated on the island, Napoleon marches back on France with a small army to regain his throne. But not after long. He runs France back into the ground, again bringing it back into bankruptcy and running all of its resources dry, just as before. Talleyrand was able to use Napoleon's desire for glory and fame, his vanity, in order to bait him into escaping from the island. Talleyrand knew that France was in a vulnerable state, and so knew that Napoleon would quickly drain its resources in his usual pursuit of grandiose goals. Knowing how to evoke Napoleon's pride allowed Talleyrand to choose the time and place at which Napoleon made his move, and thus determined the outcome of the battle at Waterloo, where Napoleon was crushed and sent to a remote, dismal island of St. Helena, so far away from France that he would never have hope of regaining power again. So he draws Napoleon out, and he defeats him once and for all. And he's able to do all of this by predicting the maneuvers that Napoleon's pride would drive him to do.